Back in the mists of time, when gaming was still relatively young, you didn't really get much of a story in games. Hell, there was barely enough room for the game itself, let alone 80 novels of text and flavour like there is today. The exception to that rule was always adventure games. A genre typified by puzzles, narrative, and insane leaps of logic, and a genre that went from riding high the sales charts of the 80s to slumping in the crap piles of the 2000s. I'm Will with Cliqist, and today we're talking adventure games. The adventure game genre has had a very turbulent history, starting out as an interesting experiment on old mainframe computers using only text, and evolving into the graphic adventure games of Sierra and LucasArts. It is arguable that no other genre has had more of a roller coaster ride. During the 80s and 90s, they rode high with a slew of successful titles like Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis, the King's Quest series, and the classic Secret of Monkey Island. Loom was better, don't at me. As the 90s rolled on, things seemed to be going well. There was innovation around every corner, and games like Myst were starting to show what an adventure game could really be on the cutting edge. But the good times weren't to last. As with any boom industry, the bubble popped. And by the late 90s and early 2000s, basically no one was making adventure games anymore. Primarily because no one was buying them. For fans of the genre, there were very few games, such as Siberia and The Longest Journey, to tide them over, but it was the indie scene that really saved the genre and kept it going. In 1997, a British programmer called Chris Jones noticed that Sierra's adventure game interface was super simple, and he decided to create a program that would allow anyone to create their own classic graphical adventure games. Adventure Game Studio, more commonly known as AGS, started out as an MS-DOS program called Adventure Creator, and was really only able to produce games similar to Sierra's early King's Quest titles. Basic graphics, simple sounds, and a pretty outdated movement system. No full games were ever created using this very early software, but it did give anyone the power to create their own adventure games at home, and it wasn't long before indie developers started taking advantage of it. By 1999, the name was changed to AGS, and Chris Jones' software was starting to gain some traction online. A small community had cropped up around the program, and the first full game was completed. Lassie Quest is primitive by today's standards, and even for the late 90s, it wasn't exactly easy on the eye, but it did show off the accessibility of the engine. With the first real game made, the eye of fledgling game developers were caught, and two in particular would help to create a rapid expansion of the AGS community. Phil Reed is perhaps not a name that too many people on the internet will be all that familiar with. While these days he has stuck to blogging about movies or writing his own stories, back in the late 90s, Phil was into game development. The Larry Vales games were some of the more successful early games released, which were created using AGS. They featured a mad scientist, an insane parking enforcement robot, and an incompetent traffic cop. While some of the jokes do fall flat, and you can tell that this was a game created during Reed's early writing career, the game's zany humour is possibly still its most attractive feature. The other indie developer responsible for the future popularity of AGS has had a slightly more illustrious career. Ben Croshaw, perhaps better known by his nickname Yahtzee, is now more famous for his series of sweary internet videos, but he has been developing video games since the 90s. Some of his earliest efforts, excluding perhaps his days modding Duke Nukem 3D, were made using AGS, and the one that inspired so many to start creating their own adventure games was known as Rob Blanc. It told the tale of a British chip shop employee being co-opted into saving the galaxy by a couple of cloak-wearing aliens. While the graphics are once again primitive, they have a surprising amount of consistency, and although the music is a little plagiarisy, it does help Rob Blanc to feel more epic than your standard freeware game. While there certainly were other games created around the same time as Rob Blanc and Larry Vales, none of them managed to show the same quality or accrue the same amount of attention for the engine. From that point onwards, many games would be released using AGS. In 2001, Plurgberg Dark Ages showed an impressive quality of writing and gameplay. A popular VGA remake of King's Quest II was made on the engine in 2002, and 2003 saw the return of Yahtzee Croshaw with 5 Days a Stranger, widely considered to be the best AGS game ever made. It wasn't just freeware games which graced the indie adventure scene thanks to AGS. The Blackwell Legacy, released in 2006, was a visually impressive game which sold for $15, an impressive price for AGS games of the era, and it eventually launched the developers into an indie success story, creating a whole Blackwell series and publishing several other indie AGS games to date. Ben There, Damn That was a freeware game which spawned a commercial sequel known as Time Gentlemen, Please, which saw a decent amount of popularity on its release in 2006, and the double pack, released in 2009, has sold nearly 500,000 copies. The commercial success of indie AGS titles even extends as far as the modern day, with games like Techno Babylon being released as recently as 2015. AGS has given us a lot of incredible games over the years, and it's possibly also responsible for keeping adventure game development alive. Even years after its release, the community is not only alive, but is thriving, and is one of the main reasons that traditional graphical adventures are still being made. The mainstream adventure games that came after still had a thriving indie spirit, but had to find other ways to stay relevant in an ever more saturated market. While the online community for AGS was growing and starting to prove itself, the AAA market was experiencing another boom. The Nintendo Wii and iPhone had expanded the casual and mobile markets, causing the creation of many new companies, and the restructuring of many others. One such company to burst forth from the ashes of LucasArts' adventure games division was Telltale Games. While later in their life they may have been known for revolutionising adventure games, Telltale didn't have much of an illustrious start. They were founded in 2005, and although they had immediate plans to create a game based on Sam & Max, LucasArts still owned the license. To keep the company afloat while they waited for the license to expire, they released Telltale's Texas Hold'em, a poker simulation which was used to test their new development tools. While the poker-themed game was a far departure from the games that Telltale really wanted to make, it did provide them with some much-needed cash flow, and showed them how well digital distribution could work. It didn't take long for Telltale to actually start developing adventure games, although most of their early work received less than favourable reviews. Bone Out of Boneville was an episodic adventure game based on the Bone comic series by Jeff Smith, and was Telltale's first episodic game release. It didn't receive much attention, and the reviews were mediocre, but the game started the trend of Telltale's licensed episodic games. Sam & Max was revived, and received generally positive reviews from critics, eventually going on to span over 3 seasons. Monkey Island, Wallace and Gromit, Jurassic Park, even Back to the Future. Telltale spent the next 7 years steadily releasing adventure games based on licensed properties. While they were making a modest income and some of their games sold well, it was what was to come next which really sparked their popularity, and eventually their downfall. The Walking Dead has conquered almost every format that it showed its face in. A cult classic comic book, a hugely popular TV series, and with Telltale's help, an episodic adventure game which would revive mainstream interest in the genre. In 2012, the first episode of Telltale's The Walking Dead was released, prompting rave reviews from critics across the board. The game featured an insanely dynamic story, driven by well-written characters, and deeply affected by player choice. Telltale had hit a peak of quality that few games have managed to reach since. With the first season going on to win numerous Game of the Year awards, and selling millions of copies, the pressure was on Telltale to keep producing high-quality games in keeping with the bar that The Walking Dead had set. The Wolf Among Us was an adaptation of Bill Willingham's Fable comic series, which received solid reviews from fans and critics alike. Tales from the Borderlands managed to pull off a heavy story focus in an action-oriented universe, and Minecraft Story Mode did a better job of adding a story to Minecraft than the official game did. Telltale had proved that not only could an indie game company become a huge success, but also that there was commercial viability left in the adventure game genre. It seemed that things were riding high for the company. They were on a winning streak that didn't look set to end anytime soon. Most of you will probably know that this story does not have the happy ending it should have. In September 2018, the company announced an involuntary major closure as the final investors pulled out. The final season of The Walking Dead, which was only 2 episodes in, would not be receiving an ending, and out of nowhere, a lot of people lost their jobs. It's sad that the studio had to close, and the story behind that could be an entire video unto itself, which we definitely didn't already make and you should go and watch it. But it's hard to ignore the changes to the indie market brought about by Telltale, and their employees should be proud of the legacy that they've left behind. No matter how you feel about adventure games, it's hard to deny that they left an impact on indie gaming, as much as indie gaming has changed adventure games. While they may have started out as a thoroughly mainstream affair, they came to embody the indie spirit that always strives to prove that you can't kill any genre that has fans enough to root for it. From their tiny beginnings on mainframe computers, to the underground success of Rob Blanc and Larry Vales, and finally, the indie giant that dominated a huge section of our industry. Adventure games have never failed to leave their mark, and they will always be truly indie at heart. My name is Will, and thanks for watching. If you enjoy Cliqist's content, then please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. If you really love us, share us with your friends, and let us know what your favourite adventure games were in the comments down below. Also, if you're into board games as well as video games, you can check out my channel.